Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining. Today, we're here to talk about the GDPR and regulatory compliance and some ways that you can come up with solutions on your end. So if that is not what you're here to listen to, you have a couple seconds. Okay, good. So I'm Jennifer Nicholson, and I oversee the GDPR and regulatory compliance offerings at Accenture. And I'm presenting with Srikanth.
Yeah, my name is Srikanth Venkat, so I'm at the Hortonworks product management team, part of the team, responsible for the security and governance portfolio, so all of the, what we'd like to call the problem children of all of our platforms. So Atlas, Ranger, Knox, Data Steward Studio, as well as platform security. And
Hi, I'm Sean Sprecher. I work with Jennifer on the data in the data business group at Accenture on our GDPR offering, and yeah, we're here to talk to you about GDPR today. So.
Yeah. And so really are the people in the audience mostly technical, or are there some business owners as well? Okay, I'm going to take that as both. But I think that I know that this conference is really geared toward technical solutions, so I'm going to try to be fairly brief in talking about the GDPR and sort of the business approach to it, and try to give as much time as possible to Srikanth to share the technical aspects of the solution. So as everybody hopefully knows, the GDPR became enforceable on May 25th. It's actually been around since April of 2016, and companies have had over a year to prepare for it. Some of the companies use that time better than others. Right? Especially in the US. We see a lot more more of an aggressive approach at reaching compliance in the European Union. But I'm going to back up a little bit just so that you guys understand what the GDPR is, and just so you have that sort of foundation of and how you can figure out if it applies to your organization. Cindy, I can give you these slides too. But I always like to see people taking pictures of them because that means that the slide was worthwhile. So the GDPR by far is the most far-reaching piece of legislation, regulation that impacts data privacy that's ever come out. The closest thing is its predecessor that's almost 20 years old. So this has a couple main impacts. What it does is it gives specific rights to the data subjects, and says exactly what the data subjects can do and should be able to do. It also codifies what the controllers and processors of data should be doing to comply with that. So it impacts everybody, every organization that manages, processes, or stores data, regardless of their location globally. You do not have to set foot in the European Union. You do not have to sell anything to anybody in the European Union. You have to have data from somebody that currently resides in the European Union. If they move, you're still responsible for that data if you're holding it from when they lived in the European Union. It's also important to note that they don't need to be a citizen of a European Union country. Here are some of the rights and the obligations associated with the GDPR. So there are 8 data subjects have 8 rights associated with the GDPR. Controllers and obligations have a few more, but these are the big ones. The nice thing about the GDPR is if you're going to have a regulation that's over 100 pages and 99 articles, at least it spells out pretty clearly what's expected of you. So it is not vague. It is really specific and really detailed. And while there is some room for sort of finding what reasonable means for your organization and being able to justify it, there's no sort of gray space around, do we need to comply, or, what's required here. It is all very clearly laid out. I'm not going to go through all of these, but I just want to touch on a couple of them. When I say that there is the right to access, this does not mean that a data subject right needs to be able to access their data through like a profile. This means that they have to be able to access how their data is being processed, stored, or transferred. That's a big, there's a big difference there. They have the right to be informed. This is through notifications, both around upfront consent and understanding of how their data is used. It's also around any sort of breach notifications. Not to be profiled. This is very clearly written out that they have the right to say how you can use their data to track their behavior. To object, that's an easy one. To data portability, they have the right to say, and this comes into play with like insurance policy holders or things like if you were taking out a loan application or your phone carrier, that you're allowed to say, I want you to transfer all the data you have for me to a different like-sized or similar organization. They can restrict processing. If they've objected, they can say you can't use my data in any way until this is resolved. Rectification, they have to be able to access their data and correct it or complete it. And then data to be erased, deleted, forgotten. This is the one that is the most open to interpretation because it impacts businesses different ways. For some organizations, it's really easy just to delete a client record. For others, that can be more complicated because there's either other regulations that require keeping it, like in the financial industry, or it could also be someplace where it's tied to inventory, where you can't delete it because that messes up something else down the line. And so in that case, you might use data masking or some other technique to achieve that. Some of the data controller processor obligations, this is where really every organization has to assign a DPO. It doesn't need to be a new role, but it has to be somebody who's responsible for the compliance program. Just a couple of big ones here. You have to do privacy by design and by default. This is really, really big. You have to justify storing all the data that you store and processing all the data that you process. There's no longer the expectation is that you process the least amount of data to successfully complete that process. And in addition to storing data by design and by default, you also have to process it by design and by default. And this leads to your breach policies and how you handle and remediate your breach and your notifications. And then records of processing is also another big change that organizations need to make a shift in. So you need to be able to show every time you process something, any sort of transaction, that you just keep a log of that, and that's available both to the data subject as well as the regulators, and that you need to be able to show compliance, and that's one of the main ways you show compliance. So really the other big thing, and I'm not getting into it, but all of the different documentation that you need to keep, the communications that you need to keep, both with the data subject as well as the regulators, and then the different types of notifications. Like I'm sure everybody's aware of all the privacy statements that they're getting. And that's everybody making changes, making their language more clear, and revising them to show exactly how they are processing data. If I skip something, let me know. I will do that. Okay, thank you. Or if I leave something out. And this is the first time that we've seen a regulation like this really have as much risk attached with it, both financial risk. You can be fined up to £20,000. What this doesn't say is that's per infraction. And once you have one, when you have an infraction, you likely have more than one because they tend to come together. Obviously, everybody's seeing what's going on with, Facebook and the reputational risk that it comes along with misusing or not clearly making your data subjects aware of how you're using their data. And so this opens up a huge data trust, data veracity issue, and really just trickles into the data ethics side of
I would
things.
just add to that too. Some of you may be asking, why do I need to care about this? Why does my organization need to worry about this? I don't have EU citizen data, perhaps, but I think this is what we're seeing. It's a real sentiment shift, both in the regulation space, but also kind of in society in terms of trust and privacy of our data, right? So one, I would say, even if you don't have data you think is applicable to this, as we mentioned, you don't have to be a European company for this to be applicable. There's a lot of other regulations out there that our solution would cure for, but also what we're seeing is these laws are coming to the U.S. There's already laws. There's one in California state right now that's up for potentially going through, and there's things in the federal Congress. And then you just have customers who have a higher expectation around how you're dealing with their data, and the customer demand and want around what you're doing with their data. So it's kind of a sea change in how people are viewing customer data and trust and the veracity, as Jennifer was saying. So,
yeah, it's absolutely. I think that every analyst out there and everybody who's thinking it through thinks that the GDPR is going to be the first of many and have a domino effect rather than being a one-off. So really, even starting now is an opportunity to get ahead of the curve on the other ones, even if you're just catching up with the GDPR. The one other thing that I will say is, nobody really about this topic, because I've got plenty to say, but is that nobody really, there's no case law to show what's going to happen with this. It's a brand new regulation, and there's a lot of people in a sort of holding pattern that are saying, it's going to take a couple cases to go through the systems to see how harshly or, how strictly this is going to be, construed in the courts. But one thing that we do know is that regulators can halt your operations until an issue is rectified. And in many cases, that can be worse than a $20 million fine. So that's worth noting.
And also, I would just add quickly, too, that besides the regulatory reason for doing some of this, as you can imagine, there's a lot of other stakeholders, whether that's just data security or some of the tools and solutions and strategies that you'll see Shrikant talk about, too, deal with the business itself. Having your data in a better order, having better management around your data increases your profits because you have a better ability to operate your businesses better because you're managing your data better. You can cross-sell. You can do a lot of different things besides just be regulatory compliant. So I would just add there's a lot of other stakeholders and reasons within the organization to do some of this. So.
And here's some of the people that we talk to, and I bet everybody in this room is serves in this capacity or reports up to one of these people. And this is one of the major challenges that we've seen, is because it's very difficult for one person to own GDPR compliance or regulatory compliance within an organization, that we see a lot of churn of even talking to people here, oh yeah, we have GDPR under control. Oh really, what are you doing? And then what they say is this one little sliver, oh yeah, that's a step in the right direction for sure, but it's so easy to lose accountability and responsibility and also lose progress because it's just kind of going around in in circular conversations. So it's once you become aware of that, where we see it be most successfully compliance strategy successfully implemented is where there is this group of stakeholders that co-own and take accountability for a holistic approach rather than just trying to impact or fix it in their area. Here's a couple things that we know for sure. Almost every company out there, 76% of companies think that doing the data inventory and mapping is the most difficult part of GDPR compliance, and 65% of organizations report needing help to do that. There is absolutely no end-to-end solution out there, so that makes it really complicated. The money usually comes from the CIO's budget, even though they only own one slice of it, which is an important slice, but that's a challenging shift to make just in your sort of headspace at an organization. And then in the US, less than 10% of organizations are ready and would say that they're compliant with the GDPR. So you're not alone if you're not ready. And then what we've seen as a successful approach is, we've seen it done a lot of different ways. We work with a lot of different clients in a lot of different stages, and where we see a successful implementation of a long-term compliance strategy is when you have an end-to-end approach. And you don't necessarily have to do it in this order, but you have to have all of the pieces in place, because I've seen doing the assessment and trying to do manual discovery, I see that actually quite often. And that approach is more of a checking the box rather than a long-term strategy. We've seen a lot of organizations that do that have been racing to compliance and now are stepping back and saying, to do this ongoing, to monitor this, we put forth great efforts to do our discovery and data discovery and mapping manually, but that's only good for that period, at that one little slice in time. And so what we're seeing is those companies having to backtrack and go through the process of taking a machine-led approach so that it's sustainable over time. We also see companies that do jump into doing the data, the machine-led approach to the discovery and mapping without doing the assessments, and and actually, prioritizing their risk and identifying what they can do, prioritizing and doing taking like a risk assessment approach and identifying their remediation efforts. They have their data, and they'll have great knowledge graphs, and they kind of go, what next? What do we do with it? So you absolutely have to have that framework of governance so that you understand and have defined what a compliance framework looks like at your organization, because it's going to be different everywhere, and then have all of the pieces fit into place. And then once you get it in place and you're monitoring and tracking, and your data is linked and everything is sorted out and you're kind of cruising along, that's when really your compliance program can become a springboard to other data initiatives. That's when you can start, really you're so far ahead when you want to tackle data veracity or, any other data project, because your data is already discovered, you've gone through the discovery and cataloging process.
And I would just add there too that every organization has different challenges. So while all of these pieces are part of an end-to-end solution, maybe your organization does one piece pretty well already, and you only need 2 or 3 of the 4. But I think that's part of it too, is having a good governance program, looking at it in a wholesome way, and figuring out what does your organization need and how can you best achieve that. So.
Okay. So now I'm going to pass off and let Shrikant show you the good stuff.
Right. Thanks, Jennifer. Thanks, Sean. So what we thought we'd do next is we've looked at what the regulatory landscape looks like, what are the compliance challenges. This conference is all about community. It's about open source. So we thought we'd take a look at this to see how innovation in the community has helped build us certain components that you can stitch together with solution offerings from Accenture and Hortonworks and others to be able to provide an end-to-end solution that at least addresses the technological pieces of it. There's also the people and people process angle that needs to be addressed, but at least from a technology side, we have a better together kind of approach that is more comprehensive. So that's what the rest of this presentation is going to look at. This is nothing new here, so this is another view into this. These are some of the subject rights. We already heard from Jennifer about those. And from the Hortonworks perspective, looking at all the innovations that have gone into the community, what we feel is needed in terms of an approach to be able to understand what's in your data lakes and other environments and be able to build a compliance program around it, we need to be first able to identify and classify what data you have. So if you don't know what you have, you're never going to be compliant. So that's everything starts from there. Once you have that, you need to be able to understand whether this is a trusted source, where did it come from, is it a reliable source? You need to be able to classify that with any kind of data classifications that apply to GDPR. These could be sensitive data, this could be personal data. And incidentally, if you talk to any of the folks from Europe, do not say PII, just say personal data, because they believe that personal data is a big superset of what is in PII. So they always say that there's all these other things that have been added in GDPR that are well above what PII standards are for the US. And because that includes things like cultural identifiers, social identifiers, things that were either unprotected or not deemed necessary to be protected. Then all of this is only scalable if you have a centralized way to manage it and monitor it, as Jennifer mentioned. And you also need to have the right data protection strategies in place to protect the underlying data that is part of these frameworks, and also be able to automate this at scale. So what are some of the open source solutions and components that help with this? So at the bottom is for your data lakes, you have your HDFS and yarn layers. We've made significant investments over the years in the security and governance tooling, Apache Ranger, Apache Atlas, and Hive, which is becoming more and more of a real full-blown scalable database and data warehouse in the future. And then we have our new offering that we announced back in the DataWorks Summit in Berlin called Data Steward Studio, another 100% open source component that is built off of all of these technologies. So you see on the top the GDPR provisions, that some of them that Jennifer talked about. There's the consent management provisions, there's the data discovery, data inventory provisions, and then the right to be forgotten. Data Steward Studio kind of stitches together some of these capabilities to provide you a path to being compliant with that. So we're not saying that if you have Data Steward Studio, they're going to be compliant. It's just that you can use the capabilities within Data Steward Studio to build a compliance program that you have a shot at convincing the regulators about the fact that you're compliant. On the right is Metron. So that's a project that has been run for a while, and that will address your cybersecurity and breach notifications. GDPR has a 72-hour breach notification requirement that can be addressed very nicely with Metron. So what we wanted to do for the rest of this conversation is to have look at two typical challenges. The first one is, how do I find out what kind of data do I have and how much of that is personal data? And the second piece is, once I've got all the stuff, given the big data platform and it's the nature of the rapidly changing the three V's, the velocity, variety, volume, all of those. How do we build a scalable platform that can help you manage some of these things? What are some tools that are available today to be able to do consent management? So we'll look at these two challenges. The first one that we wanted to talk about was understanding your personal data. So you first need to know where personal data resides across this entire enterprise. And although this is not directly referenced, this data inventory or personal data catalog, for lack of a better term, is not referenced directly. There are many that actually allude to this. So the starting point is to get this inventory so you know where your sensitive data that impacts the personal aspects of these European citizens or European subjects, as the case may be. So there's 3 articles there that are referenced. I'll let you guys read that. And then there's also other articles that reference that you need to be able to secure and analyze this responsibly. So you need to put controls in place, both from a processing perspective and also from how that data is visible and handled within your enterprise as it flows through many different technologies. Okay, so essentially what this means is you have to understand your personal data. And understanding your personal data means you need to know all of these. So you need to know where did this data located, which is the sensitive data inventory. What is this data about? So you need to have some robust classification schemes to say which of this is personal data, what domain does it belong to? Is it from my credit card processing domain? Is it from some other line of business or other activity that is part of my enterprise? And the third thing is who is the owner for this data. So most of these, you'll have to go back to who owns that from a stewardship perspective, from an ownership perspective, so you can clarify what the intent of that is and set up the right controls in place from a processing and consent perspective. And the flip side of this is who is accessing this and who has access to this. So you need to be able to know both of those. And then why was this data collected? This is going to be very important for consent. So GDPR requires you to explicitly require consent, which is why you see all these forms with the multiple checkboxes that you have to go through and multiple emails you have to subscribe and update to make sure that these organizations are complying. As a simple example, if you go to any of these European airport, try to sign up for Wi-Fi, you see like a form with like probably 10 or so checkboxes these days, because each of those are requiring, can I use your data for this? Can I use your data for this other purpose? So you have to explicitly declare how you want to use this data before you collect it. When was this data collected? How was this created and updated? These are important from just an audit and monitoring perspective. When was this accessed? This can feed into two things. One is around proving that you have the right controls in place. And the second aspect of this is when there is, God forbid, a breach, then you at least know who's touched this, when was this accessed, so you can look at that picture to prove to send out notifications to whoever the impacted subjects might be. How was this data accessed and processed? So this is, again, dealing with was the proper consent required? Was it collected? Was there a legal basis for processing this data? Okay. All right, so I'm going to pause here and kind of dive into a quick demo. Go back here. Okay, so what you're looking at here is our Data Steward Studio product. We had done a couple of deep dives on this, and we also showed some of this.
They're actually still looking at this live.
Hold on 1 second, let me go back here in the show. Maybe it'll show up now. Okay. All right, so this is Data Steward Studio. So I've logged into the Data Steward Studio. One of the aspects of GDPR is the notion that you have all of this sensitive personal data, and the first step is to first locate all the sensitive data. Where is this data located across data lakes? Maybe I have data lakes that are strewn across the globe. In this case, we are looking at our favorite fictitious bank with real problems. This is our Hortonia Bank example that we show in a lot of our security demos. So this bank has 3 data lakes in different locations across Europe. There's one that is not seem to be doing so well in Prague, and 2 others that are in a healthy state. Now we're going to go look at all of the data that's sitting in across this entire landscape. For each of these data centers or data lakes, you have a data lake level dashboard that will show you, for example, all of the data assets that are sitting in there. In this case, there are Hive tables. There are 38 of them. All of them have profilers that are on. Data Steward Studio comes built in with sensitive data profilers. So what these do is you can set these up to scan the, let's say, the Hive columns that exist across your entire footprint in that data lake, and be able to detect and classify the different columns as having sensitive data. So it uses a combination of regular expressions of different patterns of content, as well as it looks at the column header information to disambiguate the context and make sure that we are giving you higher quality matches in terms of this and minimizing the false positives. So those, in this case, the sensitive data profiler has run, and it's classified that 12 of these tables have sensitive data and 26 of them don't. You see how data is being ingested and the volume of data, how that's growing over time. There's data deleted and added, etc. You can see how the sensitive data profiler execution status has been. And this is the other piece which tells you, for example, of all the assets in this data lake, the ones that's accessed the most is this worldwide customers table. It has been accessed 955 times over the last month. So it gives you a nice picture of the access patterns of the individual assets across, summarized across the data lake. So to go further down into the assets and looking at what are the types of sensitive data that we detect. Let me actually start over here. So Data Steward Studio has a notion of what is called an asset collection. So the asset collections, think of these as a flexible way to group your assets that are sitting within a data lake in multiple ways and across one or more data lakes. Say, for example, you could have, if you're a healthcare provider or an insurance company, you have patient data. This patient data could be sitting in HDFS files as unstructured files, file content, and it could sit also in Hive tables as transactions that they've had with a particular doctor's office or a hospital. So you want to put that, let's say, Hive table along with those HDFS locations together through the business lens, saying this constitutes my patient data asset collection. So once you've grouped that, you now can get some interesting summarizations around that and also be able to collaborate and be able to share that information with others. So these are some data asset collections that have been built. Let's look at one here called customer data. And this is located in the Frankfurt cluster. So once you go look at this asset collection, that is similar to the data lake dashboard. You have a asset collection level dashboard that shows you how many assets are there, what type of sensitivity is there, what are the different sensitive columns that this table has, who has accessed this. In this case, this Sasha from this HR department in the EU division of this bank. She's been accessing this set of assets 208 times over the last month. So you can slice and dice this data in multiple ways. You can look at the trends for how this data set of collection of assets have been accessed over time. In addition, you also see some collaboration information here. So, for example, you can rate these assets. So you could say, for example, you could rate those ones that have maybe a poor quality. So, your data scientists don't end up using those. You can add comments into this, have threaded discussions about these asset collection. So you can leverage the collective knowledge that exists across the enterprise in terms of multiple actors and roles to be able to surface these things and be able to give others insight into what your knowledge about this particular data is, share that across the enterprise in multiple ways. Okay, so that's the asset collection dashboard. Then we can drill down and look at all the assets that make a part of this. So in this case, this is customer data that is coming from, let's say, a CRM system. This bank has two huge Hive tables. There's one for US customers, one for worldwide customers. Let's go look at one of them. So now if you look at this table, you can get a lot of useful information. This is what we're calling an Asset 360 page. The Asset 360 page, think of that as a Facebook page for your data. It shows you all the relevant information in one place summarized nicely. So you see here the number of rows, columns, how many are sensitive. You see the lineage coming from Atlas. All of these properties are coming from a combination of Hive Metastore and Atlas. This is properties, the metadata properties that are in Atlas. You see the range or audit logs summarized here to show you who are the top users who touch this asset or this particular window. You see how many access requests have come in, how many have been approved, how many have been denied because of security policies. You also see some system-generated tags. This is where the sensitive data profiler goes in and classifies the data and suggests suitable classifications for the columns. And as to what types of classifications are here, so you can see that on this, there's a national ID column that has social security numbers. We also have a column statistical profiler that goes and gives you the shape of the column so you can understand missing values, malformed values, etc. All of those kind of shape characteristics and content characteristics. In this case, this is numeric data, so you see a histogram and a box plot. You also see this column called tags. This is where the sensitive data profiler has gone and auto-suggested that this national ID column has the type of social security number. So in this case, it's a U.S. customer, so the national ID in case of U.S. persons is social security numbers. We also have a whole bunch of 70 plus sensitive types that are detected by these profilers. So this include like all of the European member states, passport IDs, the IBAN numbers corresponding to these countries, telephone numbers from pretty much worldwide, birth dates, etc. So it's a whole host of sensitive elements that we detect out of the box, and you don't have to do anything other than have these profilers running at whatever schedule you think is appropriate for that case. Okay. So in this way, you can get an inventory of your existing assets. You can schedule these profilers to say run depending on whatever ingest frequency you have within your data lakes, and the profiler is going to go work in the background and then surface this information, and it shows up nicely in this UI. You have some small amount of workflow built into this, which is the stewards can go and say, oh, this doesn't look like a social security number. This is wrong. I want to remove this as a false positive. And then in that case, these tags will not be associated with those entities in Atlas sitting in the cluster, which means you let's say you associate it, in that case, you will be able to apply any security policies via Ranger that you have on that. On this table, we can also show you all the security policies that have been defined and the audit data for all the raw audits. Every single access to this table is audited. You can see some rich metadata that's surfaced on that. You can also schedule these profilers to run at any frequency, so you can configure to say, I want to do an exhaustive sample, or I just want to take a 10% sample before I detect that, before I call that this column has this type of data. Okay, so we'll switch back to the presentation here. All right, so we looked at how we can get all of this information. So we looked at where the data is through the profile, what it's about, there's classifications on those, who owns this, who has accessed this, all of this you can get from the Data Steward Studio. The second thing that, I think we're running a bit low on time, so I'm going to just show you what the concept here is. So we do have the ability to centralize consent. So let's say there are multiple applications on the front end which are collecting information, and you want to monitor that consent in one place. You can centralize all of that into, let's say, a consent master table in Hive, and then apply a single Ranger policy that dynamically will filter out those subjects who have not given consent. So we have some ability to do that today out of the box with this. And then with other offerings that we will build with Accenture, you can now take this to scale, and we have other workflow tooling built into this to consume those items to go back, push it back into the source systems. Other things here, so the consent needs to be specific, explicit to this purpose. And then we looked at all of these items here and how they can be affected. And the last thing here is this, again, very critical. Maybe I'll let Jennifer talk through some of these. The final summary here. Yeah.
Right. This is just really saying that once you demonstrate compliance, it's not the end of the road. You've put together a really healthy data ecosystem that this can, go on to launch other data initiatives like data veracity and other things that are really going to benefit your organization.
Yeah, I think the key things, one of the key points here on this slide that we want to make sure is that there is risk with the data that you have, but there's also risk with, for example, if you're going to a single vendor or closed source kind of solutions, what this approach gives you is the ability to say you don't have that vendor lock-in. We have a collaborative ecosystem of vendors and partners who can help you if you go down this approach to addressing GDPR. And that's very important because these technologies do change very frequently, and also it gives us the ability for your enterprise to be resilient in the face of those kinds of changes. So,
and not only are there benefits to the approach beyond GDPR, GDPR, as we said, just to restate, is an ongoing monitoring requirement. So even though it became effective on the 25th of May, it's still it's going forward. You have a requirement and an obligation to do this continually. So,
yeah. And going down the open source path here buys you the at least the additional benefit that you don't have that vendor lock-in, but you're also leveraging the latest and greatest that a community as a whole has vetted in some way. So rather than putting all your eggs in one basket, you're at least benefiting from that community approach to doing this. Right? Right. That's all we had.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Up. Yeah. So if anybody has any questions, I know we ran out of time, but you can come by the Accenture booth or the Hortonworks booth, and we're all able to speak to you at more depth about this, about our joint offerings.
We'll also be around for a little while, like outside, if you want to talk right away. So, all right. Thank you.